Hello and welcome to the Srijan Wednesday webinars. If you are joining us for the first time, this is a community initiative by Srijan Technologies, where you can tune into some great sessions on topics ranging from front-end technologies, UI/UX, mobile apps, to media, entrepreneurship, community building, and digital marketing. In today's webinar, we will take a look at how to automate some powerful backend capabilities for your Drupal site using the Drupal 8 rules. Our speaker today is Josef Dabernig, who will take us through some examples of how the D8 rules will change the way we build sites. A bit about Josef before we start. We all better know him as Dasjo, and he is the Deputy Head of Technology at a.k.a. Labs, Switzerland. He started working with Drupal 5 in 2007 and got involved with the international community during a social service stint at Nicaragua. His contributed modules include the Facet API Pretty Paths and his diploma thesis GeoCluster for putting millions of items on a map. What Josef most enjoys is connecting with open minds from all around the Drupal community, from training Drupal across Central America to organizing Drupal events in Europe. Thank you, Josef, for joining us today. And before we start with the session, I would request all participants to please type in all questions that you have during the presentation, and we'll take them up in the last 15 minutes of the session. Also, please don't forget to take the conversation live on Twitter using our hashtag SrijanWW. You can share your thoughts by tagging us and Josef in your tweets using our handle @Srijan and @Dasjo that's up on your screens right now. So without taking up any more time, let's get started. Josef, over to you.
Cool, thank you. Hello, everybody. Excited to be here. And thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me for this, my first webinar. So let's get started and dive right away into Drupal 8 and rules. First, I've been introduced already, so you might know me from contributed modules in Drupal 7. The Facet API Pretty Paths allows you to turn the Facet URLs into SEO-friendly URLs. And I spent quite some time on the GeoCluster module to optimize putting a lot of points on maps. But what really makes me passionate about Drupal is the community. And I've been traveling around the world already a lot, doing Drupal in Central America first. I've been a very active member of the Austrian Drupal community. We organized a couple of Drupal camps in Vienna. And as I've moved to Switzerland, I'm also helping out with the local community events. For example, after this webinar, I'll join the local community for a monthly Drupal user group meetup here in Zurich. And also tomorrow I will fly to Spain to talk at the Drupal camp in Granada. Actually, I've probably met a few of the listeners in February in Mumbai. It was really exciting to connect with the Drupal communities from all over India. And that's why you can see this image on the right-hand side at the DrupalCon Asia. As mentioned, I'm the Deputy Head of Technology at a.k.a. Labs. So you can see the various team members that we have. We are quite a small company compared to international or Indian standards, but we are really, really passionate, and we are on the forefront of technology. a.k.a. Labs has adopted Drupal 8 already 2 years ago, and in the last 2 years we have launched over 10 websites on Drupal 8, and we now build every new project just on Drupal 8. D8 rules, so that's the name of the initiative that I'm representing, and the rules module, it's not created by myself, nor I'm the main developer. But as you can see, I'm responsible for communication, and we have a whole team. So Fago, he's Wolfgang Ziegler, the rules creator. Then there's Klausi, the commentator. We also have Fubi or Sebastian on the team. Nico and Steve have been helping out. And over the presentation, I will show you that the team is much, much bigger actually. So we can see that just alone working on the rules module, there's various roles involved. And before we get started, I would like to get a feel of the audience. Which of the different aspects in Drupal are you working on? We have a poll coming up. So yeah, are you more like a backend developer or front-end developer? Do you consider yourself being mainly a site builder who does configuration through the user interface? Or are you actually like a site manager managing your own site? Are you a site owner? I'd love to get your feedback on that.
So we have about 30 seconds to put in your answers, and a lot of our attendees already have. So we are just waiting for everybody to put in their answers.
Oh, exciting. I haven't done this online poll webinar before.
Ten seconds to go. All right, so out of all the polls, 42% of the attendees today are backend developers, 16% are front-end developers, 32% are site builders, 5% site managers, and 5% are site owners. So that's the results of the poll. Joseph, over to you.
Thank you. Cool, that's interesting, yeah, because when we talk about rules, I think there's two main audiences. But what is rules, actually? We'll find out about the audiences over the presentation. So the rules module, for those who don't know it yet, it's a very generic system based on three principles. So we have the events, we have the conditions, and we have the actions. Based on those three components, you are able to define or combine or react on any kind of event that the system provides. Then after that event has triggered, for example, the content on the website has been updated, we can execute arbitrary conditions. And in this case, we execute a condition, okay, we want to check if the content author is different as the acting user. And if one or all of these conditions have been met, then after that, the rule will actually fire and execute an arbitrary set of actions. And one example for such an action could be, okay, now I want to notify the content author about the update because the content has been changed by somebody else, and we want to inform the original author of the node. That's like one very specific example. But if you think in abstract terms, and I would believe that as there's a lot of developers here in the audience, you might be familiar with like abstract systems. We can implement any kind of event, we can implement any kind of condition, we can implement any kind of action. That's really what makes rules so powerful. It's basically a Turing-complete machine that is configurable through the user interface. And that will make the other half of the audience excited, like the site builders. They can actually log into the Drupal website and create their own configurations on how to automate a Drupal website based on rules. So we came up with the logo over the course of this initiative. And here I want to summarize the main features. So we can build flexible workflows using those components, the events, the condition, and the actions. And a very common example is that we allow the site builder, the person that configures the website, to send out customized mails to notify users about something has happened. And that's a very valid case because if we don't have rules, then these notifications, we would implement them via code. So whenever the email body would have to be changed, and you would have to ask the developer, hey, can you change this text for me? So giving the powers into the site builder actually relieves the developers of having to implement low complexity logic and putting that powers into the end users. And there's a lot of use cases for rules, like we want to create custom redirects based on certain criteria. We can also trigger different breadcrumbs to be displayed. And when we take a look at the ecosystem, so for Drupal 7, there's 30% of all the Drupal sites, they use rules. So it's maybe not the module that you use on every site, like views, but it's used on a hell lot of Drupal sites. And there's really interesting is that there's so many integrations. So the way that I think the power of Drupal as I've seen it over the last years is really that we have so many interconnected modules. It's not like in WordPress where you install a plugin and it does something very specific. It like brings you just this one use case, but it's more like we have building blocks that then fit very well together, like the field API, the entity API, all of these, they fit very well together, and rules is another building block that then can be extended by any other contributed module. So we have integrations with the web forms, with context, with features, with search API, and a lot more. Even field formatter conditions can be specified using rules. So it's really exciting to have seen that uptake over the last years from Drupal 5, 6 to 7. The rules module got really, really important. Now, when we think about Drupal 8, we, as the people behind rules, we get really excited about the new possibilities, and I want to quickly talk about which they are. So Drupal 8 by itself, it brings us object-oriented programming, like features like dependency injection. It brings us fresh APIs. It already comes with better testing based on PHP unit, and by leveraging the Symfony framework, we have a much cleaner code base and much better organization of the code. If you're familiar with rules in Drupal 7, and if you have looked into the code, you can see that it's already very object-oriented, that it already leverages its own plugin system, similar to ctools. So that's like the direction that we were already foreseeing, but now with Drupal 8 we can really base upon a solid foundation, and developing for rules just makes a lot more sense because we follow the exact same patterns as everything else in Drupal 8 does. We've also removed a couple of legacy modules. There's web services built in, and the front end become responsive. Even the backend become responsive, and that for certain will be interesting for rules itself, because rules is this very powerful admin UI that now people will also expect to work on mobile. So we have to think about how can we make the rules UI responsive itself. So when we talk about Drupal and rules per se, I've mentioned that there's the plugin API, so we 100% leverage that, and I will show you how it looks like. There's the entity API, which got really popular in Drupal 7, and a lot of that knowledge from the entity API has been incorporated in Drupal 8 and has been made even more abstract. So when you learn Drupal 8 as a developer, you should really look into the type data API, which is just another abstraction that allows to describe any kind of structured data. And then rules will benefit from that, because rules wants to know which kinds of information is it dealing with. So when there's a rule reacting on a node update, rules will be able to inspect all the data that the node object has. Like it can access all the fields. It can even traverse from a term reference to the term entity, from the author relationship to the node author object. So that really makes it powerful. That way, having all the type data structure and the annotated metadata in rules, we can really allow site builders to have a user interface that really knows how the data structure is built, and I think that's like the #1 selling point for Drupal, that all the power that the site builders have goes back and forth from the backend, from the lowest level APIs up to the admin user interface. In Drupal 8, there's even a condition and action API in core. So that's really exciting because, well, we need conditions, we need our own actions. So we're really excited to work together with them. Unfortunately, we had to fork the Actions API, but at the moment we want to backport those additions to the Actions API. And we have also been collaborating with other initiatives, like with people working on Core and Page Manager together on the Context API. The Context API is exactly about that, so that I can specify which of the structured metadata will be available for a condition, for an action, for an event to be provided. And finally, you guys might be familiar with the features module in Drupal 7 and 6. So now as we have the configuration management initiative, all of the configuration can be exported in a standardized way, and we don't have to implement the special serialization features that we had in Drupal 7 for rules. So we got thinking into, okay, rules for Drupal 8 will be exciting, and there were just even more great ideas. So similarly to what the Chaos Tools suite is, so the C tools basically stems from views and panels. All of these modules together, they formed a common ground for innovation of new programmer functionalities in Drupal 7. And a lot of the C tools functionality, like plugins, got incorporated into Drupal 8. So when we're always thinking of how can we implement a functionality in a reusable way so that it's not only specific for the rules module itself, but that it can actually integrate itself into the larger ecosystem of Drupal. So a few requirements that rules has is, for example, it needs tokens. So when I've mentioned the example where we have the email body to be specified by the site builder, and then in the email body, the site builder obviously wants to use tokens to be able to specify, okay, and here use the username as an address, and so forth. So these tokens, we need to work on type data, and that's a problem that Drupal core by itself doesn't solve, or the token module doesn't solve yet. So that's something that we then can contribute back as a reusable component. And we're still figuring out where these components should live, but we implement them in such a way that it can live in our tools or somewhere else. It's not like that you have to install the rules module itself to be able to leverage that kind of functionality. Another part is the type data widgets and formatters. So when we specify a rule, let's say the rule it takes an event as an argument. So the event would be node has been updated. Then after that node has been updated, we specify a condition where we say, okay, now compare the author to be different than the logged in user. So on that data comparison, we know, okay, we need an author, so that's like a user object, and then in the widget that will be configured, it will be something similar. So that's like an entity reference. To the next point, the extended context API. So that's something that rules really needs, and that's something that doesn't have to live in rules either specifically. Also, we're really interested in, so the rules user interface is something that site builders learn, and a lot of people, for example, when they use Drupal Commerce, they will first get into the rules UI because they want to use Drupal Commerce. But in some cases, it might not actually be needed that they dive into the rules UI itself, but we want to just embed parts of the API in other places. So one place where that can happen is that we want to embed conditions into the block administration. So when we configure blocks, we want to be able to specify the visibility of a block based on a rules condition. And that's not something where you have to jump back and forth between the blocks admin UI and the rules UI, but we can actually integrate the conditions UI in there. Finally, you might know the data selector for tokens. So here's a screenshot where we can see this very, very powerful main feature of rules where users are able to drill into the data and find the data objects that they need. And also rules is so clever based on the data definition. It knows which of the attributes you can use and which of the attributes you cannot use, or even based on you have specified a condition that the node is of type article. So based on that information, you will be able to access all the article-specific fields on that node. So having that data selector functionality is something that's maybe a nice admin user interface extension for other modules as well. Like when you specify a context thinking about I'm using panels, and there's the ctools context API thing in Drupal 7. So when we now in Drupal 8 use specify context for panel panes and panels, we would be able to use the same data selector that Rules has implemented as a reusable component. Right. Then from a site builder's perspective, well, Drupal 8 brings a lot of admin UI usability improvements. So one thing is that there's always a primary button that indicates how to save, or that the admin UI has been componentized so that a lot of stuff from the admin UI has been aligned to follow patterns, like the drop-down buttons. They all follow the same patterns. And Rules really wants to leverage the same to align with all the rest of the backend, so that it's not its own island, but that we reuse the same functionality. Maybe you have noticed that Drupal 8 has simple views bulk operations integrated. So when you go on the admin view, let's say you're gonna administer your content, then you can select a couple of nodes and perform an action on them. And that's like the perfect case for Rules, because we can just extend the actions that the Drupal core has. And that way, similar as you have the use case in Drupal 7 where you have to install the views bulk operations module, in theory it would allow you just by Drupal core plus Rules that you can perform arbitrary actions on content or users or anywhere where you have the simple bulk operations in core. A common thing when working with Rules is that having all that power and flexibility. I have seen a lot of websites based on Rules in Drupal 7 that end up having a lot of Rules components and nested components, and you kind of end up building your logic bottom up, because first you have to specify a component. You have to specify for the component its parameters, then you implement the component itself, and then you can use it somewhere else. But actually, from my perspective, the way how you build logic is more like outside in. So you would first want to create the outer part of the logic, and then you add a condition inside it, and you add an action inside it, and then you want to be able to build it from top to bottom. So the concept that we call inline rules is that instead of having the rules components, rule sets, rules conditional modules, you would be able to build the logic tree outside in, and then you can mark specific parts as reusable. Finally, deployable configuration. As mentioned, the CI initiative allows us to export any configuration for rules in Drupal 8. Okay, yeah, that got us all excited. That was like a first introduction of what to expect for Rules in Drupal 8. And now I'd like the chance to take the second poll in order to find out if you folks have experience with Rules already. So I want to know if you have been using Rules in Drupal 7, if you have already worked on Rules in Drupal 8, or if you have no clue about Rules at all.
So once again, we have about 60 seconds to put your votes in. So and we have 30 seconds to go. 10 seconds. I wish all of our attendees have put in their responses. Okay, so we have about 80% of our attendees who have used rules in Drupal 7 or earlier, and 4% have already worked on rules in Drupal 8, and 16% of them haven't used rules yet. Joseph, over to you.
Thank you. That was 16% who haven't used rules at all, right?
Yes, that was 16% who haven't used rules at all.
Cool, yes. So there's a lot of people waiting for rules in Drupal 8, and I will give you an update about the current development status, but I quickly want to highlight how it's even possible that we get there. Because, working on such a big module is a huge effort. And we were not able to just say, okay, we can just take time, so the estimated amount of work is 1,000 hours. And the people working on rules, Fago, Klausi, they are both employed or have their own companies, so they basically work full time. And working on the rules module for them, also being maintainers of the Drupal 7 versions and working on other modules, working on Drupal core for them is like a very time-consuming job. So we sat together and formulated, okay, we need this kind of initiative in order to first motivate ourselves, like formulate a goal, this is where we want to go, and also to find help from the community, from others, from a financial standpoint, so that we can free up development resources for them to kind of provide the funding. So the goals that we have formulated are, okay, we want to accelerate the Drupal 8 uptake by ensuring that rules as a key contributed module is ready early enough. Because if rules is not there, basically all of these 30% of Drupal 7 sites that rely on rules, they cannot be upgraded, or they have to implement it in another way using custom code, and that's not where we want to go. So rules for Drupal 8 is really about enabling any flexible workflows for site builders, being configurable and reusable. And one of our goals is also like to make Drupal contributions sustainable, because it's really, really great that all the free contribution time that individuals put in. But at some point, if people like have full-time jobs, they are not able to provide that community time anymore, and they need their companies or they need others to sponsor them if you want to work sustainable. So we came up with Drupal Funders. That's a website that provides crowdfunding for Drupal, and we launched the first very larger campaign on Drupal Funders, and we're really lucky and grateful that we got over 300 contributors, together with a lot of sponsoring companies. They founded already 60% of the rules module. So don't get frightened by the number. So we are talking here about 2 Austrian Drupal companies, and what they usually charge is 90 euro per hour. So that's like an average hourly rate in Austria. And the 2 companies, Trunomics and Epico, they agreed on a community rate by halving the hourly price, so 45 euro per hour, which is basically covering the self-cost. And we have estimated a bit more than 1,000 hours. So that's how we come up a bit over 47,000 euro. It's like the whole funding that we need in order to be able to complete the rules module. And that doesn't include sprint time or anything else. That really is having Klausi and Fago solve the hard problems for rules. And we got that funding, like the first milestone, we got funded half by Drupal funders and sponsors. And the second milestone, we got funded exclusively by Acquia, which we are very grateful for. And for the last milestone, we are still actively looking for people to sponsor us, or we just work on it on our free time. So what's the rules development status? we have successfully finished the first milestone. And the first milestone was really about implementing the fundamentals. So we have implemented the rules core engine. We have defined the different plugin types like conditions, actions, and events. And we have spent really a lot of time aligning the APIs that we need with Drupal core. So one of the reasons why it took us a lot longer was also that the Drupal 8 release cycle itself took a lot longer. So that, for one hand side, gave us more chance to improve the core APIs. But at the same time, as you might know, the Drupal core implementation workflow is a lot slower than working on the contributed modules, because in Drupal core, you have to find agreements with a bigger community. You find better solutions together. At the same time, it's just a more time-consuming and slower process. But we're really glad that we could improve a lot of the underlying APIs as part of the first milestone. And the last big thing was that we have the parameter configuration and the context mapping implemented for the first milestone. And just a month ago, we finished milestone 2. So that was like a very, very big sprint that started last fall after DrupalCon Barcelona. Acquia got in touch with us. We got the milestone funded, and we could block the development resources. And in that time, we have completed a lot what we call the rules MVP or developer preview. Like so when you now go on the rules website, you can already download a first snapshot of rules, and it will actually work. I can show you that a bit later if we have time. So all the foundations, they are in place, and that includes the additional plugin types, like we have added loops, we have implemented events, we have finalized the whole plugin API. We now have full integration with the CMI, so we can already export rules configurations, we can export the rules components, and there's also integrity checks included. So if something is misconfigured, the system will automatically detect it. Then initially we had planned the user interface for the third milestone, but we realized that from a motivational point of view, we could not postpone the UI so far anymore. But the UI really gave us something to play around with, something where you can actually already configure conditions, events, and actions. And we have even implemented the autocomplete functionality already. So that's really exciting. There's also an API, so you can already implement the rules UI if you are working on another Drupal 8 contributed module. And when we talk, so I've mentioned the tokens that are really needed, and we've implemented a very fancy Twig-style token replacement system, where you, similar in Twig, where you can append filters to variables. You can now also append filters for date formatting or for uppercase, lowercase formatting of strings. So that's really exciting. Now, this is where we are. So milestone 3 is up. So what we need to complete is obviously the stable 8.x. We're working on the 3.0 branch release. And what that includes is finalizing the engine follow-ups, completing the rules user interface. There's also the rules scheduler module that has to be ported. And there's a lot of existing integrations, but they are almost done. So that's really cool. We can take a look later on. And how we got there is, well, so we started over 2 years ago. And from my perspective, rules is not only about implementing a module for everyone to be used, but it's also a really, really great way to teach the Drupal 8 best practices to the community, to get involved with others, and to have like an exchange with developers, because it's a really nice way to get your feet wet with contributing. So you can see that we have conducted a couple of events in a lot of different European countries, especially, but also in Mumbai we have been sprinting on rules. So this weekend now, I will be giving a talk in Granada. Then we have been in Heidelberg. And this is where we do a sprint, or we do a training, or we do a session and talk about like more specifically of how rules works. And that led to a lot of contribution already. So if any one of you is interested in working on a contributed module for Drupal 8, go check out the rules module. We have already 40 contributors and counting. And I cannot see the closed pull request number here, but we can just check that out in a minute. Because how can any one of you get started with rules? And I want to quickly take a look at two different things now. I believe we have now, like, let's say, at least 10 or 15 minutes left before we go into the Q&A. So what I want to do next is take a look at how the development process works, but also what you can already see when you use rules for Drupal 8. So let me jump out of my presentation mode, and let me know if you don't see anything anymore. I will just hide this here. Okay, so as you might see, something that's a bit different to the standard Drupal.org process is that we develop everything on GitHub. And you will see that a lot in the Drupal 8 community. People just prefer the pull request workflow over the patch workflow in order to be able to collaborate, to give feedback inline. We find the GitHub workflow to be much more efficient. So we can see that there's more than 40 contributors to the rules module already, which is kind of exciting. And when I go into pull requests, this is where all the improvements can get merged in, and the improvements are either by the main developers, by Klaus Ifago, or they are by others from the Drupal community. And the amount of contributions so far is really exciting. So we have 427 closed pull requests, and that's just awesome. If I scroll down here a bit, we can also see that we have contributing guidelines. So they will explain how we put, so we still work on the Drupal.org issue queue, but the actual code changes, they are handled in pull requests. We have automated tests, so everything is covered by unit tests or by integration tests. So that really ensures that we are able to iterate on and that we follow best practices and that the code base gets stable in the long run. So if you're interested in learning about automated tests, for example, you can also go into the rules issue queue and pick a task from there. How does that work? So on our rules initiative page, what I have is a couple of resources that will provide introduction. And then there's a link that's called Find Contribution Tasks. And that directly takes me to our roadmap issue and takes me to a section where we can see novice, contributor, and advanced issues. So basically, the novice issues is where we place very easy tasks that are best to get started with. Contributor tasks are those that we feel anyone from the community can take a look at and work with us together on improving the system. So there's tasks like the integration. I want to send emails out. Well, let's take a look at this one. So there's the port send mail to all users of a roles action in Drupal 8. So that's what I mentioned, porting existing integrations. And we can see that there's back and forth, and there's like pull requests. And in these pull requests, people will propose their changes, and they will get immediate feedback from the maintainers on, okay, this has to be improved, this has to be improved. And then in the end, it gets merged or it gets re-rolled. So that's a really good process to work together with experts that have like years of experience and that have been shaping Drupal 8. Yeah, kind of exciting. So that's like the development side of things. I can go a bit deeper if we have time into that. But I also want to show you what rules provides at the very moment. So I'm just switching over to a local installation of Drupal 8, where I have enabled the rules module. And as we know it from Drupal 7, under configuration, we have a section called workflow. And by default, there's nothing in there, but as we have enabled rules, it will add the rules admin UI. So we have the section where we can create reaction rules, which are the default. Reaction rules, they react on something. So let's say I want to notify about content update. That's like my reaction rule. And here I can select from a list of events that the system provides. And that's just plain rules with Drupal core. And we can see a lot of events are already implemented. So basically, most of the integrations are already ported. We can see that there's like, if something has been deleted, if something has been added, if something has been updated. So I would be interested now if content has been updated, then I want to do something. And this is it's a live demo. Let's see if it goes well. So if a content has been updated, I'd like to show a system message. Let's show a message on the site. And here we can see that we can already switch between the data selector that allows me to drill into the information that is available at the moment. Or we can go into direct input mode where I can just say my custom message. We can see that, for example, the message type, it's not yet a select. So we don't have the type data widgets that we need in order to be able to provide a select drop-down here. But at the moment, we have to manually specify that this is a message of message type. Then we can save it. And rules works the same way now as views does. So any change that you do is not automatically saved. That was like a bummer in Drupal 7 that you couldn't prepare something until you save it, but it was automatically saved. Now you can see that, I have unsaved changes, so I have to remember to save them. So that's us creating our first reaction rule. I want to be notified about the content update. And let me jump right over and see how that works. So I have already an article in the system. So I would believe now that when I do an update on this article and hit save, there, ta-da, we got it. I have the custom message being displayed. So that basically demonstrates that rules is already working. It means there's a lot of rough edges in the system, but this kind of basic functionality of being able to create reaction rules based on different kinds of events, then being able to configure conditions. We can also add conditions here. So we can check, for example, if the node is of a certain type. Again, we can specify what kind of node we have. And here the data selector should be the right choice because I want to react, or I want to compare the node that has been provided by the event. And I want to compare it now against the content type. And as I don't have this drop down here, I would say it should be written as article. So we can already specify a couple of conditions. We can add multiple of those. We can already specify a couple of actions. The system provides a lot of actions. And finally, we can save that. Then we have components. So that's like the reusable components that don't have their own event, but that can be integrated as reusable functionality elsewhere in the system. We have like basic settings about logging debug information, showing debug information. So that's already in there. And that's kind of where I want to switch back to the presentation. to give a brief overview of what else is there. So if as a developer you're interested in working with rules, your main task will probably be writing your own conditions, actions, and events. And here we can leverage the plugins API. So instead of writing, like we did in Drupal 7, writing an info hook, we can now just implement our own condition plugin. As an example I've presented here is the node is sticky condition, and it uses all these Drupal 7 patterns that you will see all over, Drupal 8 patterns that you will see all over the place. So it uses annotations in order to describe the functional, describe the metadata. So the annotation here says, hey, I'm a condition. This is my ID. I'm the rules node is sticky condition. I have a label that is translatable node is sticky. I'm in the category node. And I have a context that we can take a look later on. So that's the pendant to the info hook that describes a condition. But now we have it together, and I think that's really exciting about Drupal 8, that we have the plugins describe themselves rather than procedural code as an info hook describing functions that then get glued together to a logical piece that developers usually don't have an overview of anymore if you have a lot of conditions and actions living in the same module, for example. So that's really a big improvement in terms of developer experience. When we take a look at the lower area of it, we can see, okay, the node is sticky condition is a class, and it extends from the rules condition base. And all we have to do in order to implement our own conditions is to implement the evaluate function. What it does is just it provides the return value of true or false. That's what the condition defines. So in this particular example, in order to implement the node sticky condition, what we have to do is we want to get the node, and there's an API function that allows us to get the context value, and then object, the system magically will turn the context provided into a node object, and we just have to execute the sticky method on it. The same way actions are implemented. So when I take a look at the delete action, I want to delete an entity, so I will have an execute function rather than evaluate function. And the execute function, it doesn't have to return. It can, like rules action, they can also provide returns, but they are mainly about executing some logic. So in this case, after we have loaded the context entity, we can perform the delete action on that entity. And I think the API is really clean, it's really nice. So Drupal 8 contributed module developers or people interested in providing more core integrations for rules, they can really work on these very beautiful APIs to implement functionality that is not very complex, but that will make a big difference for the site builders when they can use that and rather than having to implement custom code by themselves. Yes, I could go a bit more into detail about the events. There we leverage the Symfony event system. So rather than implementing our own events, we can specify them in YAML files, which is really cool. But when looking at my clock, I think I'm like at 50 minutes now, and I want to take time to ask the host if we should go into question and answers or how much time we have.
Hi, so I guess you can take a few minutes to go in a little deeper. I think about another 5 minutes to see if you can bring in a little bit more info. Until then, I would ask all our participants to start typing in their questions and we can take them up with Joseph in a few minutes.
Sounds good. Should we also start the last poll?
All right, I can launch the last poll right now.
Yes.
So
So I'm curious to find.
we have about 60 minutes, and I would like all our participants to start putting in their answers, please. We have 30 seconds to go. Ten seconds. All right, so all the votes are in, and 47% of our attendees think that the most important is to provide an intuitive UI for site builders, and 32% think to provide as many integrations for events and APIs. 11% want to write developer documentation, and 5% write end user documentation. Joseph,
Cool.
over to you
Sounds
now.
good. Thank you. Yes. So we can see that. Yeah, I think rules is really the. So today our main audience is developers, but also I think when we take a look at the usage, like as widely spread as rules is, um, there's always these two kind of audiences. Um, I have the tendency to think that more people are site builders using rules than developers, but that doesn't mean we should prioritize one or the other. We just know that okay, it's really this interesting gap between um, providing the site builder already the capabilities of a programming user interface. And sometimes that frightens people. Sometimes they create logic that is not performant or that is a bit too crazy. But I think just having that power is really nice. And for when we now think about Drupal 8 with CMI and with the workflows that we can develop based on the configuration management initiative, I could allow the site builder on a staging side to prepare the logic as they want it. And then the site builder will create a pull request with the configuration export. And as a developer, I can review if the site builder has made logic changes that make sense. Or as a developer, I can also review the performance implications of these logic changes that the site builder have performed. I think that's really a nice way to have a symbiosis between those who prefer to work in the user interface and those who are developers. Yes. So another exciting point about Drupal 8 is that we have Symfony, and Symfony also brings us an event system. And that basically allows us to get rid of most of the Drupalisms that we had in Drupal 7. So the hooks, it's something that a regular software engineer, a regular PHP developer is not familiar with. But in order to be able to develop for Drupal 7 or also for Drupal 8, in some parts, you have to learn a system called the hook system. And now this kind of can go away. So we can leverage Symfony events. We can annotate them. So we have YAML files that will describe the events. We can take a look here. So if I switch into my IDE, so I will see that there is a rules events.yaml. Like make that a bit bigger here. So here is where we can see that, for example, the user login and the user logout. These are two events that we describe in a YAML file, because we already have the hooks and the events in the system, but what we need to add to them is the metadata, is the context information. So in the context section, we actually describe what that event will provide. So it will provide an account of type entity user. That way, rules then knows that when the user logged out event has been fired, the object that it provides, it can be used as an entity of type user. There's also something called derivers. So when you look into Drupal 8, you will come across the concept of derivers. And what the derivers do is they allow us to create plugin derivatives. And when I switch back into the website, let me go out of here. So when I'm in the rules user interface, when I create a reaction rule, we can see that there's a lot of events. But they kind of follow a similar pattern. So we have, after deleting a comment, after deleting a contact message, after deleting content, after deleting custom blocks. And here we can see, okay, so we are able to react on events that happen after deleting a specific entity per type. So what it does is, in the system, there's only one plugin that's called after deleting an entity, and the derivatives will be generated based on all of the entity types that the system has. That way we provide the site builders something that they are more likely to understand, because the site builders might not think in abstract ways on the entity level, but they want to react on after deleting a comment rather than after deleting an entity and then specify which entity type. So that's also something that's interesting when looking at the code base. So when I take a look here, for example, in the actions, I do have an entity create action. And then I also have an entity create deriver that, based on all the entity types, will create derivatives. So that's like a bit more of an advanced example when taking a look into the code base. All right. Yes. Let me conclude this by going to, so these slides, they're also available via a link that I can provide afterwards. And we take a bit more of a look of how a programmer can also invoke their own events, how the whole context system works. So I've mentioned that the contexts have to be specified for rules to be able to understand what kind of data it's dealing with in order to parameterize the user interface. Yes, so we have a bit more there. And then also we explain the configuration management details. So how we shift away from our custom implementations to now having the YAML files specify exports of the data. How you can execute the components yourself, how the type data API is leveraged below. So we have like primitive data types, like float would be a primitive, like just a number, or we have complex data types where, for example, a link consists of a URL and other properties. So one of the use cases, besides writing events, actions, and conditions, was to describe your own data to rules. And here we deal obviously with the type data API. So we now implement our own data type plugins and there's still some hooks to be implemented in order to extend the data type infos in Drupal 8. So not everything has shifted away from hooks yet, but I think in the long run everything will shift away from hooks. Yes, I have given you a brief overview of the user interface, and I want to conclude this presentation by mentioning that contribution, it can be via code, and I think I've given a few very interesting examples where you can work on plugins, where you can work on automated testing. So that's really appreciated. But also in general, if you're interested in helping out with the rules initiative, or if you're interested in helping out with anything in Drupal in terms of contributing, you can do so via providing graphic design, you can do so via coordinating your own sprints, you can do so via marketing efforts, as Srijan, for example, here does with the webinars. They are both informative, the community can learn, but it's also something that provides marketing value to Srijan. You can help us with translating the user interface for Drupal 8. We would really be interested in going a step further with the user interface. So the basic user interface is in place right now, but doing usability tests or trying out new ways of how to work with events, actions, conditions, and the logic tree. I think there's a lot of potential to get involved, to not only use the module, but to actually be an influencer and take it to the next level. That would be really appreciated, and feel free to get in contact with me or with anyone from us. We're always looking to collaborate, and I think, yeah, that would be awesome. Looking forward to your feedback, and thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Joseph. That was a really very exhaustive presentation where you started off right from conceiving about rules to how you went to developing and how much work has already been done. So we have a couple of questions here with us right now. So what would you say is the most important benefit of the D8 rules as compared to what was existing before this?
So the most important improvement with D8 rules is that there will be rules for Drupal 8, because without D8 rules, and let's say it's one part is the code, but also the whole initiative, without the initiative, we just wouldn't have had the time and the motivation to get this over the ground. Because imagine you create contributed modules in the days of Drupal 5, and then you iterate on it doing so rules was created as a thesis while Fargo was studying at university, and rules was part of automations related to a distribution called Recruiter. So there was always like a connection back and forth between the business needs and between a vision, but also like being a student allowed the creators of rules during their thesis to dedicate a lot of time onto it. So that's also, I think, the reason for its success, because a great mind has had a great idea and had the resources to work on it. So maybe that's like an abstract answer, but without D8 rules, the rules module would just not be available for Drupal 8. So I think that's the main benefit.
That was about the initiative and how it all started. But in terms of functionality, how is the rules for Drupal 8 like largely, like as you had mentioned, it is like D8 rules but on superpowers. But so what would be the superpowers you would say here?
Yes. I think the Symfony event integration is a superpower. Leveraging Drupal core best practices is a superpower. That we have action plugins, condition plugins that are easy to write is a superpower. That we have extensive test coverage is a superpower. For the site builders, we are still at the early stages, but the inline rules concept is, from my perspective, the game changer for rules in Drupal 8 because I have had a lot of situations where I wanted to create a bit more complex functionality with rules in Drupal 7, and then I hit a block where I had to go and download another module like rules conditional, or to create a lot of subcomponents in order to organize that kind of logic that I want to use. So that was really, I think that's like the game changer.
Okay, so as we can see in the presentation right now, there are a lot of things that qualify as contribution. But in terms of code, what would be the major areas that you would like Drupalers to contribute to?
Sure. So at the moment, I think the main areas would be to go download the module and play around with it. There's a couple of rough edges, so you will easily find bugs. Then you can report those bugs or look at the issue queue if those bugs have already been reported. That's like the first step, and then fix those bugs because we are getting closer to a stable release. And the biggest parts there is like to help us flesh out the bugs and to pick up contribution tasks. In the line of contribution tasks, that can be working on the rule scheduler port, for example. That would be like a bigger task. It could be also if you're a maintainer or if you're interested in helping out with any other contributed modules. We have already seen other people start work on integrations for the flag module for Drupal 8 and for the scheduler module for Drupal 8. And there's a potential of over 300 Drupal 7 modules that have integrations for rules. So when they get ported for Drupal 8, they will also want their integrations to be ported. So that would be another very interesting part. That has a big impact on the site builders because when they have all integrations ported, then they will be able to make use of rules for Drupal.
All right, so I would request all of our attendees today that if you regularly do contribute to Drupal, to put in your contributions for the rules as well. And as you can see, there are a lot of areas where you can put in your efforts, and let's take the rules, Drupal 8 rules, closer to a stable release. And lastly, as you mentioned on about the funding and how various companies came out to support rules for Drupal 8. So would you say a large part of whatever you have been able to achieve with rules for Drupal 8 is because Drupal has such a supportive community?
Yes, definitely. So let me switch again here to our list of supporters. And that's just highlighting the main companies, but also the whole Drupal Funders campaign. Yeah, we can see that Drupal Funders is not on a certified HTTPS, but like really all this interaction with the community is really helpful. For one side, in terms of providing actual funds, but also in terms of collaborating with us in the issue queue. That's really something that motivates us, and where we see that in the long run, by being able to onboard new developers, in the long run, it can also be more sustainable because it shouldn't be just one or two developers having all the burden of maintainership on it. But maybe in the long run, we can also bring in more developers that can work continuously on rules or any of the subcomponents that we've been talking about. And being able to collaborate with this international community is really exciting, especially when we go to sprints. I see that in India there's a lot of companies running sprints, and a lot of Drupal camps or DrupalCons. There's a sprint happening. I think that's really where the magic happens, because you can sit together, you pick a task from the issue queue, you try to solve it together. So that kind of combination of, on the daily business, being able to work on the issue queue online, but also to go to events, to sprints, and collaborate in person, I think that's really what makes the Drupal community shine and what makes us as an open source content management system and framework so competitive, so successful.
We definitely agree with that, and I hope this webinar helps you get more contributors for rules for Drupal 8. And with that, I think we have come to a close of today's webinar, and I would like to thank Joseph for taking out the time to share all about rules with us, and it was a really interesting webinar. And on that note, I would also like to announce that our next webinar is on Agile and Scrum practices, and it will be hosted on the 4th of May 2016 and would be led by Sumit Gupta, Agile Coach at Srijan Technologies. For registrations and more details, you would be getting a mail from us, so stay tuned. And thank you once again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you, Joseph, and thank you all our attendees.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.